My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute, and we are here again doing what we do at the Wilson Center, is to bring scholars, practitioners together to discuss issues of interest, issues of public policy of interest to Brazil, in the case of the Brazil Institute, also to Brazil-U.S. relations. This morning, we are very glad to have with us Luis Gabriel de Azevedo. He is a director, sustainability director at the energy, or vice president for energy at the Construtora Norberto Odebrecht, which is one of the leading construction companies in Brazil. I will not read the full biographies, but just give you some highlights. I find it very interesting, Gabriel's background, because he's a civil engineer. He has advanced degrees from U.S. universities, mainly University of Colorado in Fort Collins. But he has worked at the World Bank, at the World Wildlife Federation, and now works in Brasilia at Norberto Odebrecht. So he brings, he has experiences from different fields, and he, I think, is a part of a newer generation of business executives in Brazil that see the world in a different manner compared to 20, 30 years ago, when Norberto Odebrecht Construtora became the important company it is today. We have the pleasure also to have with us Christine Penzic, who is a dear friend now, a consultant to the Wilson Center, working with us in a project we are developing with USAID. Christine knows Brazil, has lived in Brazil. After college, she went to São Paulo, where she worked on issues related to planning on energy with someone that's maybe familiar to you, Professor José Goldenberg. She also worked at Nature Conservancy on Brazil here in Washington. So we organized this to give Gabriel a chance to have present to the main presentation. He has a PowerPoint presentation. The subject, as we announced, is it possible to use the rivers of the Amazon to increase Brazil's capacity to produce renewable energy? Most of the capacity Brazil has now to expand its hydro power production is in the Amazon. The Amazon is a subject of attention worldwide, is a subject of attention in Brazil, which is good news. It was not 25 years ago. Just yesterday, the federal government in Brazil approved the first step in the licensing process of a new hydropower plant in the Amazon region, in the Rio Xingu. We are going to focus, however, on the first two, or especially one of the two first hydropower plants authorized in that region recently. There has been some in the past, under sort of a new conditionality, environmental conditions and an environmental plan, and that is Santo Antônio and Giral. They are located in the Madeira River in western Amazon. With that, I would like to give Gabriel the floor.
Thank you, Paulo. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here, despite this, and thanks to Paulo and the Brazil Institute for the invitation to speak to you today. I lived in D.C. many, many years, and I used to come to the center to watch and to participate in a number of very interesting events, and I think the Institute really serves a fantastic role of providing a high-level springboard for disseminating issues relating to public policy and development in Brazil. And therefore, we are very grateful at Odebrecht for being able to be here and speak to you today. Why are we interested as a private company on the issues of sustainability and energy development in Brazil? Obviously, we are contractor. We build hydropower. Over the past 10 years, we have been the largest builder of hydropower plants in the world. In 2008, we were number 2 to HydroChina, but other years before then, we were number 1. We are also an energy producer, but as one of the largest private groups in Brazil, we, as many other groups and as the Brazilian society in general, are very much interested and concerned with the pattern of development in the Amazon. I think the Amazon represents to us a huge opportunity, but it also offers enormous challenges. So it does require some specific thinking and very specific strategies to deal with the Amazon, and that's also part of our interest as a private group operating in Brazil. So what I'm going to try to do today is to speak a little bit to you about the sustainability or the question of, is it possible to develop sustainable hydropower in the Amazon? And I'll try to split my presentation basically 4 parts. The first one is trying to provide my answer to that question. Then I will show you a few slides in terms of an outlook on hydropower development in the Amazon. I will use the Santo Antonio hydropower plant that we are building in the Madeira River as an example of what we've learned and the things that we are doing towards sustainability. And then I'll just draw some conclusions and recommendations and open the floor for our discussion this morning. Before I start, it's important to highlight that Santo Antonio is the first hydropower plant built in the Amazon since 1989. So it's been 20 years without any hydropower development in the Amazon. The last hydropower plant in the Amazon biome, not the Amazon basin, the biome, the forest, construction was completed in 1989, was the Samuel Dam. Before that, you had Balbina, constructed in the late 80s, concluded in 88, Tucuruí, concluded in 85, and Coaraci Nunes concluded it in 75. So it's been 20 years. During those 20 years, many things happened in the Amazon. Deforestation rates increased substantially and peaked out, and now they're going down again. But during those years, bear in mind that there's been no implementation of hydropower plants in the Amazon. So we've learned a lot from the past. We've learned a lot with other infrastructure programs that have been implemented in the Amazon over the past 2 decades, but we do not have recent examples. So Santo Antonio is very symbolic because it opens up a huge opportunity to Brazil, but it also serves as a huge, gigantic challenge to us as private groups, to Brazilian government, and to society, to be able to show that we can indeed develop hydropower in the Amazon on a sustainable basis, and that we have learned from past experience, both in the Brazilian Amazon and elsewhere in tropical forests. So, what's my answer to the question? It's a very strong yes. basically because we do not have alternatives. Now, we must be able to develop sustainable hydropower in the Amazon, and I'll just pinpoint some reasons to you. First, there is a very high and growing demand for energy in Brazil and in the region. Second, we see hydropower as a clean and renewable source of energy, and with the debate on climate change, it brings to the fore again the opportunities to focus more on hydropower. Thirdly, there is a huge hydropower potential in the Amazon, and I'll show some slides that relates to that. Fourth, the cost of expansion due to scale factors of hydropower in the Amazon is much, much lower than the implementation of other sources of renewable energy in Brazil at least, including small hydro and other hydropower plants, and I'll show you a slide of that comparison. And we believe that hydropower can contribute to local and regional development and can bring about environmental gains as opposed to simply mitigating environmental impacts. So due to those reasons, we feel very strongly that as a country, as a society, we need to be able to develop hydropower in the Amazon, but we need to be able to do that sustainably, and we think that that is possible. Couple slides on a very brief outlook, and this is something that we could speak about forever, but just 2 or 3 slides to show you why there are so many comparative advantages of for energy production in the Amazon. Slide I'm showing you now is a comparison that I've done, and I've updated. Actually, I started to do that comparison when I was at the bank, and Alessandro Palmieri, our dams guru of the bank, is here. But if you normalize the hydropower potential of North America here on your top, let's see here if I can come back somehow. Well, this thing is too fancy. I have to just use my fingers. Okay, if you normalize the hydropower potential in North America, you see that roughly 70% of that potential has been explored. In Europe, we have a potential that's about 20% lower than in North America, out of which 72% has been explored. In Asia, we have huge potential, out of which a fifth has been explored. The African continent has a potential which is similar to that of North America, and just a little bit has been explored. And in South America, I haven't included there Central or the Caribbean, Central America or the Caribbean. South America alone, we have a potential that's about 6% higher than the potential in North America, but only 33% of that potential has been developed. So what you see is that nature has offered the region a significant potential to tap into, which has not been tapped into before or yet, and obviously this is an opportunity. If one looks at the government's energy expansion plan in Brazil, this was the situation in '98. Out of our installed capacity of about 100 gigawatts, about 81 gigawatts were from hydropower. So 81% of our installed capacity came from hydropower, out of which about 10% of that was on hydropower plants in the Amazon. If you look what the projections are for 2017, and we are talking about 9-10 years, we're going to increase our installed capacity by about 55%. Hydro is going to increase to about 110 gigawatts, with 33 gigawatts in the Amazon. That represents that out of the projected increase, 53% is going to be hydro. And out of that 53%, 86% is going to be in the Amazon. So basically, our entire potential for expansion over the next 10, 12 years is going to be in the Amazon. And beyond, but just looking at the plan for the next 10 years. This is something that I have recently developed based on the recent public auctions of energy that illustrates to you another very important comparative advantage of the Amazon. These are the tariffs that won the auction for Santo Antonio, the blue one, and Giral, the green one. First one was 78 reais per megawatt. The second one, 71 reais per megawatt. That's the price for which the tariff for megawatt for which the plants are going to be built. Now, if you look at what has happened with other hydropower plants in the south of Brazil, auctioned out of the past 3 years, it's over 120 reais. Small hydro, 162 reais average. Wind, over 140. Biomass, over 150. And that's granted that both for wind and hydropower there is subsidies because the government wants to promote. So the real cost of wind and hydropower is much, much higher. This is the price that won the auction, which includes a significant subsidy by the government that wants to promote those types of energy. So you see, the price of development in the Amazon is lower than any other renewable source that we can come up with in Brazil. Again, it's another pressure, it's another opportunity to move towards that potential. So, having said that, we formed a group that bid for the concession of the first hydropower plant auctioned out by the government in the Amazon since 1989, which was Santo Antonio, and we won that concession in 2007. We started the construction of the plant in 2008. So I'm going to use Santo Antonio to illustrate some of the differences between what we do now and what we've done worldwide in the past in terms of hydropower, which I think are quite significantly. I think they offer a very strong sign, a very strong indication that we can indeed do sustainable hydropower development in the Amazon. Obviously, construction is just starting, so we don't have all the answers yet. What we have is a lot of work, a lot of studies, a lot of partnerships on the ground, some results that indicate to us that we're in the right track. But we will continue to monitor the process. But we definitely know by now that Santo Antonio is going to be different than any other dam ever built in the Amazon and elsewhere. I think it's going to be different in a very positive sense. If you look from the sustainability standpoint, I think we will learn from it and we're going to do even better in the future. But I think Santo Antonio is going to represent a milestone to Brazil and to the development of hydropower worldwide. And I'll just show you why that is. Before I start, it's important for you to have a basic understanding of what the legal framework is in Brazil for public action of energy potential. The government basically auctions out to the public the potential to develop an energy project, be it biomass, be it wind, hydropower. So it determines the potential of a site and auctions out. It's a public auction. And what companies that apply for that, they have to create a special type of company that's called a specific purpose company, an SPA in Portuguese. And it's a company that is created with the specific purpose of implementing that energy project, operating it for the time of the concession, and then at the end of the concession, there's a process to decide who is going to take over the plant. Concessions are usually go between 30 to 40 years, depending on the concession. The concession is 35 years. So the company that won Santo Antonio is called Santo Antonio S.A., and it's an SPC formed by two public energy companies, Furnas, which is a federal energy company, and CEMIG, which is the energy company from the state of Minas Gerais. Two banks, the Spanish Santander and a Brazilian bank, Banif, and two construction companies, Odebrecht and Andrade. So Odebrecht, the company that I work for, has 20% share on the SPC, on the investment. And we also lead a consortium of companies that has been contracted by the owner of the project to build the project and deliver it when it's ready for operation. This consortium of companies led by us involve a second construction company, Andrade, and it involves a large number of other companies, especially equipment manufacturers such as Alstom, Voith, and others. A little bit of a timeline so you understand that that's the first difference between Santo Antonio and what used to be done before. The ideas for developing dams in the Madeira date back to the 19th century. So Now, there's been studies before. But the current study, the continuous effort to put this project in place, started in 2001. And it was basically an initiative of a partnership between Odebrecht and Furnas, in which the companies invested about $100 million at risk on studies alone. So first, we revised what we call inventory of the river's potential. So what is the cascade in the river? Where are the best setups and potentials for implementing hydropower plants into that cascade? That was approved in 2002. Then we started a feasibility study that lasted about 2.5 years, which was approved in 2005. Parallel to the feasibility studies, we started the development of the terms of reference for the environmental studies and the implementation of the environmental impact assessment. In 2005, we started the creation of this program here that I'll show you later what it is and why it was created. It's a program that we developed for training of labor, of people in Porto Velho's region. After we finish up the environmental studies, we had to complement the information at request of environmental agencies and due to suggestion that we received from NGOs. So we complemented that study. It was accepted by IBAMA. There were public hearings about the project in 2006. In 2007, after the public hearings, the government auctioned out the project. So up to now, there was no companies on the project. It was a project that belonged to the Brazilian government. The way the framework works is, since we took upon ourselves the risk of developing the environmental studies, if we won the auction, it was our investment. If we had not won the auction, in the case in Giral, we also did the studies, the company that wins the auction reimburses the companies that have taken the risk to develop the studies. So in the case of Giral, as an example, we did the same thing. We did not won the auction. The Suez group from France won the auction, and they reimbursed us for the cost of the studies that we incurred to get the license and develop the project. So we won that auction. We got our implementation license, which is the second step in the license process in Brazil, in 2008. We started construction in September 2008, and it's been roughly a year now. This year, we are going to start to energize the first transmission line. The first, in 2011, again, this is another milestone that relates to sustainability, and I'll show you why later. Only in 2011, we're going to have the major diversion at the river, so we're going to basically have 3 years of construction without really touching the center of the river, and that's a consideration due to biodiversity. And we do that in a very concentrated effort at the end of construction in a small time frame. And we anticipate starting commercial generation at the power plant in early 2012. And we'll finish up the implementation of the last turbine, number 44. There are 44 turbines in this plant in 2015. So it's going to be a span of 15 years of continuing efforts and work before we can say that this hydropower plant is complete. For those of you who don't know the region, here's Porto Velho, the capital of the state of Rondônia in the western part of the Amazon. There's a major highway that connects Porto Velho to Cuiabá, and that goes next by the river. And here's Santo Antônio, about 8 kilometers upstream of Porto Velho, and Giral is about 130 kilometers upstream of Santo Antônio. This is the border with Bolivia here, and Peru and Bolivia here. In terms of the setup that we work with, and these pictures are about 2.5 years old, it's a very complex setup. It's still an area of frontier expansion. It's slowing down, but you still find in the region illegal mining, what we call garimpos, illegal logging, burning. This is the reality that we encountered before we started the project.
How far is that from Porto Velho, you mentioned?
This is within a 20 kilometers radius of Porto Velho. So you don't have to go very far to see this type of thing. So, and I like to highlight that because this was the reality on the ground, and many people do not perceive that that's the case. This is the Madeira Bamoré historic railroad, which is basically falling apart. This is how the people live in the area, and it's got one of the highest rates of malaria in the world. So this is the reality in the ground. Some of the features that we think were different from our past experiences, meaning Brazilian past experiences and experiences that I've been involved with in other hydropower programs, and which we think that have made a significant difference in what's happening in Santo Antonio today, which is a quite positive environment that we find working the project today. First, it was the first time ever in Brazil that the terms of reference for the environmental impact assessment was developed following public meetings organized by proponents. So that's not required, that doesn't happen. The terms of reference for any infrastructure development in Brazil are developed by the proponent, that's given to IBAMA, the environmental agent, and that's approved. This is the first time that before giving to IBAMA, presenting to IBAMA the terms of reference, the proponents actually sat with communities, with environmental groups, and worked together on the development of the terms of reference. The companies involved organized 64 public meetings before the official hearings, and the goals of those public meetings were to provide communities and with information about the projects, what was going to happen to them, what were their rights, who was going to be impacted, how, what employment opportunities would be developed. So there were 64 meetings organized before. Each community was visited at least 3 times with an introductory meeting, then a directed meeting in which communities would develop their demands, present their concerns, and a third meeting in which agreements would be reached in terms of course of actions to be taken. We think that it was a huge effort, but made a significant difference. We also had registered inventories of properties and assets before the project even went to auction. And those inventories offer a fantastic and solid base upon which the rights of people that live in the area before were ensured. When you do a project like that, there's always some land grabbing and people coming to take advantage and displacing local people so they can get compensation from the companies. So what we did in that case, we decided to do registered inventories before the project ever went to auction. We signed an agreement, release agreement with what's called Ministério Público, which is, it's not the public attorney's office. It's a figure that you don't find in many countries. I think there's 2 other countries that have something like the Ministério Público. But it's a branch of the judicial system that has total independence to monitor anybody in government or in the private sector. They're completely independent in Brazil. They are the people, for instance, who brought down President Collor many years ago. And there's a lot of, they have a lot of power in Brazil and a lot of independence. So we signed a release agreement with them from day one, and we actually have deposit into the Ministério Público over $1 million so they can hire consultants to monitor what we do. And again, this was totally voluntary, in addition to the regular monitoring of the government. A few other things. After all that, we had 4 public hearings as opposed to 1. We developed a very strong and respectful relationship with the 2 major indigenous groups in the regions, the Caritianas and Caripunas, with whom we have a very good relationship, very proactive. We talk to them on a daily basis. We really don't have any issues with indigenous communities in the project. In the case of Santo Antonio, there are no indigenous communities affected directly by Santo Antonio. There are indigenous groups in what we call the indirect area. The case of Jirau is different. They do have some direct impacts, but in the case of Santo Antonio, we don't. But even though we have a very good relationship, we again, before the environmental impact assessment, there was a strategic environmental assessment conducted, and there was a significant effort, and I'll show you why, on assessing the workforce available to us in Porto Velho, the goal there was to see what could be done in terms of mitigating migration to the region from other parts of Brazil. These are just few highlights that we thought made a huge difference. At the time, they required a lot of work, a huge investment, but I think it's definitely paying off today in terms of our ability to develop the project, to be better informed, to relate better with the communities, and to increase our chances of really developing a sustainable project. Very quickly now about Santo Antônio, I think there are some features that I have to show you that also relate to the aspects of learning from the past and trying to do better. Santo Antônio is first a run-of-the-river system as opposed to a storage reservoir. And it was a technology effort developed in Brazil to use bulb turbines at this magnitude. Bulb turbines, which are low-head turbines, run-of-the-river, exist for many, many years. If you go to Europe, and Abel and Alessandro are here, and they know this better than I do, there's all over the Danube and other rivers. What happens, though, is that in most of these places, they're small. The largest bulb turbine that existed in the world before Santo Antônio was a 25 megawatts turbine. Most of the turbines existing in Europe are between 5 and 10 megawatts. In Santo Antônio, we had to bring this up to 75 megawatts. So they are the largest bulb turbines ever developed in the world, and there are 44 turbines in this plant to allow us to still have significant hydropower production without flooding. And it's also important to highlight to you, this is what a bulb turbine looks like, and this is a general scheme in which you have a low head, you don't have a lake, and the water goes to here, activates the turbine, which generates power and comes out on the other side. So sediment goes through, water goes through, there is very little storage. It's important to realize that by adopting this technology, Brazil as a country has forfeited the possibility of doubling the energy output in the Madeira River. Had we built a traditional Kaplan-type storage reservoir, we could probably produce as much, not probably, certainly produce more energy in the Madeira in one dam than what we do in Itaipu, which used to be the largest in the world. Now, the drawback to that alternative was that it was going to flood a lot of forest. It was going to flood a lot of forest. It was going to flood communities. So as a society, Brazil, by adopting this alternative, has said, we're going to forfeit on the production of 5 to 6 thousand megawatts of power for the rest of life. And that's 5 to 6 megawatts of power is one of the largest hydropower plants in the world. So basically, the trade-off that I want you to understand is by doing this, Brazil has said, we will not ever build 5 to 6,000 megawatts of power, which is about 6% of our installed capacity, so that we find a solution that balances energy output and environmental conservation. And this is a map of the Madeira in the dry season of 2007. And this is what the lake of Santo Antônio would look like if it existed in 2007. So you can see that in the dry season, it's basically in the river. In the wet season, it is smaller than the annually flooded area by the river. Virtually, there is no lake to a system like that. And what that translates into is, how am I doing time-wise? Okay. If you look at some of the hydropower plants developed in the Amazon before, Balbina, Samuel, Manso, or Tucuruí, you can see that the relationship between flooded square kilometers by megawatt produced was on this order of magnitude here. And I call this an indicator of environmental efficiency. When you look at Santo Antônio Giral, this is what you see. So it's a factor of over 100. So we are 100 over 100 times more efficient if you consider how much we flood per unit of energy produced. What that allows us to do also is to develop a layout for the hydropower plant, like this layout here. And I'm just going to stand up, try to explain that to you. This is the river here. It flows from left to right. If we were to do a regular project, we would probably have to close the whole river with a continuous dam, do deeper powerhouses, create a lake over here, and it would take us probably 6 to 7 years to ever turn on the first turbine and produce any energy at all. And the river would be closed. There'll probably be a detour somewhere for most of that period. What this layout allows us to do is we are working here on the left side of the river, and we're working here on dry grounds, on the left bank and on the right bank. We're not touching the middle of the river. So where most of the water, most of the biodiversity goes, it's free-flowing right now. We'll finish construction here, and we'll finish construction there. Because this is a run of the river, we don't need a huge lake. We will start to produce energy here. There are 3 powerhouses in this dam. We have 8 machines here. We have 24 there, and the other 14 over here. So we'll start to produce power here. Then we'll finish up the spillway, and when the spillway is ready and all the machines here, turbines here installed, we'll finally do the river diversion through the spillway of the dam. So we won't dig huge canals around to divert the river. We'll just divert it. We will close it here. It will flow through the spillway back here. And then in about 11 months, we'll close the center, finish up what we have to do here in the center, and put the river back. So that's, again, it allows us to progressively produce power and work the river so it has the least impacts during construction. Some of the other lessons we learned, it's really essential to share benefits with local populations. And one of the ways that we found to share benefits with local populations in San Antonio and still mitigate environmental impacts was to invest a lot on capacity building and training. And we started this program, which we call Acreditar, which means believe, even before we won the auction. And by then we had invested about $6 to $7 million at complete risk on capacity building. Today we have 41,000 people registered in our training program. The population of Porto Velho is about 360,000 people. So we have over 10% of the population of the capital city registered in our free capacity building program. And why did we do that? When we finish up the environmental studies, and Sandra knows that well because at WWF she was looking at some of these things, the forecast was that only 30% of the labor force required by the plant at peak of about 13,000 people, 12,000 people, were to be hired locally, and that 70% would come from outside. That would represent an influx of about 30,000 people in the Porto Velho region. We thought that that was too much, and by investing in the Acreditar, we thought we could invert the situation and say that we're going to hire only 30% from the outside and 70% locally. And we'll do this by creating capacity, by training these people that had no skills before and allow them to find other jobs in the future. This is the situation today. 82% of our labor force in January 2010 comes from Porto Velho. It's all local. Only 18% comes from the from other states in Brazil. The Acreditar is, as I said, is a free volunteer program that we offer to anybody in the city. They go to a basic evaluation, a health evaluation, psychological evaluation, and they can be trained in these types of facilities. They have theoretical training, including health, including financial management of their salaries, environmental management, and then they can choose what they want to do. We have developed with the equipment manufacturers specific computer-based simulators so these people can learn first in a simulator how to operate large trucks and large machinery. This is another simulator room. And then we have a training facility in which they basically learn everything they need to work in the construction of a dam. Bear in mind that these people were not contractors before. No? Now they have developed these skills. 15% of our labor force, 14% is also made of women, which is another first for us there, trying to involve more women in the process of building this dam, this project. Practical training involves practice with real machinery, graduation and certificate so that they're empowered. They have no obligation to work for us. Some of them work for our competition in general. Some of them work on projects in Porto Velho. Our only goal is to, if we have better trained labor force locally, we'll have better labor force committed to the company, committed to the project, and we'll leave something behind. So there's no obligation for them to sign contracts with us, no requirements or anything like that. It's the first time ever in Latin America that a large project has voluntarily developed its GHG emissions estimates. We've just completed our estimates of emissions in the construction site. And I have to apologize because I couldn't translate those slides, but as you can see, we know exactly what the major sources of emissions are. No, we've done everything from fuel to transport to electrical energy, GLP for cooking, explosives, sewage, solid waste. We have the profiles of emissions through the construction cycle from each one of these categories. And we're able, for instance, what this allows us to do is, by changing the types of trucks we use, we're saving 30% on diesel, which corresponds to 75% of our emissions. So by understanding the processes, we can make decisions such as this, to use different trucks and save on fuel. So we are saving money by doing this, and we're polluting less. We know the type of gases that we emit. We know the distribution between types of fuel, by type of activity in the construction line. By within each category, we know, for instance, transport, this is the transport of supplies to the job site. That's how it emits over the life of the project. This is the daily transport of workers to the job site. This is transport of people that come from other states to roads, and this is air travel. So we know exactly by every segment of the construction what our emissions are going to be, and we are monitoring that on a yearly basis. We look even the smaller sources of emissions that correspond only to 6%, we know exactly how they distribute. And for instance, we have a policy in our company that 100% of our waste is treated, 100% of our solid waste is treated and or recycled, and it's the case here. So that's why somebody asked me, how come you have only 1% of emissions from solid waste? We recycle about half of it, and we treat the other half. Other things that we're doing that we think add value, open up the discussion, contribute to sustainability. For instance, we work, and Greg is here from the WWF, we work in a program in which we voluntarily propose to the government to deposit about $31 million into the ARPA program, which is the largest program in the world to conserve tropical forests. It's a program led by the Brazilian government in a partnership with WWF, KfW, and FUBIO in Brazil. And we have proposed to them an alternative in which companies that owe environmental compensation to government, it's not our case, we don't have any back payments due, but we took upon ourselves to develop a proposal of an institutional arrangement in which companies that had back payments due in terms of environmental fines, environmental compensation, could transform those payments into the ARPA fund. It's not approved yet. We've been working very hard with the government. It's been 18 months. WWF is working with us on that. We hope it will be approved soon because this is going to be a major source of revenue from private companies into conservation units in Brazil, specifically in the Amazon. It's an arrangement that you see involves a public-private partnership. On one side, the funding, and on the other side, the implementation. And it's been very successful with ARPA. And we think that it would be great if the government is able to develop the framework through which private companies can support that program. The last one, and in terms of innovation, does anybody know what this is? Yeah. This is our model of a fish ladder. For instance, fisheries are very important in the Madeira, and since the initial studies, we have hired the best people in Brazil and the best people in the world. We have the top 2 guys in the US, the top guy in Canada. They were working for us on projects. And about 3 months ago, we are sitting with this group of scientists in Porto Velho, having a beer at night, and we asked them, have we done everything that we possibly can do so that we can say that we're going to have the world-class fish passage? He says, there's one thing that you guys can do. And we asked what, and they said, you can still do a model that nobody has done before. So we can bring students and researchers. And so these pictures are from last week. The scientists and their grad students from several universities here and in Canada are going to be there next month. And we're going to be monitoring. This is in the Madeira River, upstream from the dam. And we're going to do, for the first time, physical monitoring on a model of this scale. This is bigger than fish passages in many dams, even in this country, and it did cost more. But these are the things that I think a project like this also offers as an opportunity in terms of sustainability. It is a great source of knowledge creation. So we are very much engaged with research institutions such as Museu Geld in the Amazon, IPAN, some NGOs, because you can't waste an opportunity like this. Nobody has done this before. And to the extent that we can transform our investment into knowledge with universities, with grad students that can learn, can develop research, can give us feedback, can point what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, I think this is also a benefit for future projects. So I'm just about to close here so we can talk. In terms of conclusion, I'm going to be very quick. I just highlighted here some tips on what I call roadway to success. I think, planning is very important before we do something like this. Projects need to be relevant to the national and regional development. If they're not relevant, if it's just a political project, it's very hard to build the ownership and the support to do something like this. We need to learn from past experience, and what I've shown here to you today is what we've tried to learn. We need to anticipate risks and major challenges as much as possible. Sharing benefits, as I said, with local populations is fundamental. It can't be something that's going to just benefit the populations in São Paulo and Rio. Partnerships with local institutions, be it social groups, NGOs, local governments, is also a key to success. You have to have a long-term view on the project cycle. You can't think that you're just going to walk in something like that, build, cash in, and leave. You have to realize that we're going to be with this project for the next 35 years. It changes your perspective on how you do things and how you relate to the local population. You need to be transparent about the things you do. You need to be an effective communicator so that you can exchange information, you can respond to questions, you can explain what you're trying to do. State-of-the-art science and technology is still fundamental. No, you're not going to have the technological breakthroughs that you need to mitigate impacts, to build win-win situations if you don't do that. And you need to focus more on really what can we do in terms of environmental gains as opposed to simply mitigating. The idea of ARPA is part of our proposal to do that. We think that by doing this we can indeed improve the management of conservation units in the Amazon, and I think that's an environmental gain as opposed to mitigation alone. In terms of learning, what this experience has consolidated within our firm, and now I'm speaking to ourselves, is a view on the project cycle that we follow, which involves more feedback loops than before, in which we study, we plan, we implement, we monitor, and we assess the results, and we feed back the process so we can do even better in the future. And finally, when you talk about sustainability of hydropower in the Amazon, beyond the Brazilian Amazon, I think governments still have a very essential role, and I'll just highlight to a few things that I think is fundamental. First, we need to be able to bring the discussions on licensing to a higher level. Brazil just issued yesterday the preliminary license for this mega project called Belo Monte in the Xingu. And the whole discussion on the license process is, should we do Belo Monte or not? In my view, that's wrong. That decision needs to be taken at another level. So when you get down to look at a project, you can really focus on what can you do to mitigate and to improve. The strategic decision on how you approach developing the Amazon. Are we going to follow a go and no-go strategy in which some rivers are closed forever and others are not? I don't know. Are we gonna follow a delay strategy in which we develop first hydropower programs in those rivers that we know better, and we delay any development on rivers that we don't understand well until we get that knowledge? I don't know. But those decisions need to be taken at a higher level, not in the licensing process of each individual hydropower. And I think that is the major recommendation that I give to governments. We need to be able to engage strategically, look at this thing in the Brazilian Amazon, beyond the Brazilian Amazon, strategically. What are we going to do? Why are we going to do? How are we going to do? What's our strategy? So that those decisions can be taken at that level. And once you go down to the project, you are not discussing if that project should be done or not, because that decision would have been taken before, and you would be discussing and focusing using energy and resources on how do you do it well. I think the role of government in command and control is very important, establishing minimal limits and boundaries upon which people need to operate, but that's not sufficient to raise the bar. You need to have a systems of incentives in place so that people don't limit themselves only to the minimal requirements of the legal framework. And I've tried to show you a few things that we have done that we believe is way beyond what the minimal requirements are, but government should provide incentives so that other companies, other investors do more in that sense. Which incentives? I don't know. I mean, that's up to discussion. There could be sustainability requirements on public procurement. I think that's an effective incentive. There could be matching grants for programs. There could be public recognition. I don't know which incentives, but I think it's important to induce people to do more than just observe the law. You need to implement reforms that are necessary to the implementation of innovative ideas and arrangements, and I refer to the ARPA. No, the only thing that has prevented us to work with ARPA has been the lack of ability of the government to do a very, very simple, is it a decree? I don't even think that's a decree. It's a decision by a minister that's taking 18 months. That's the only thing that's preventing us. So those types of reforms need to be done much quicker. Enforcement is still very important so that better performers are not paying for poor performance. What I was telling yesterday in a meeting in a group of USAID people was that if you're a better performer and you disclose and you report, you are at higher risk in the Amazon, because those are not good performers. They go under the radar screen. They live under the legal system, and they're never caught. Now, if you voluntarily report and disclose, you're much easier prey, because if you make one little mistake, that's a mistake that everybody sees. So this is a very perverse type of system, and we need to invert that cycle. And finally, I think the governments have a very essential role in leveling the playing field and making the rules of the games very, very clear for the development of these programs in the Amazon. So that's what I had today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I would like to ask now Christine to comment for a few minutes, and then we will open.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulo, for the invitation to participate in this very interesting and timely, really vital discussion. I wanted to also thank Gabriel for an exceedingly high-quality presentation, reflecting the fact that something that I think we all acknowledge, that Construtora Odebrecht really is widely acknowledged as a company that goes the extra kilometer, that goes the extra step in terms of its execution of projects, and is in many regards on the continent a world leader. especially as the case of the bulb turbine here illustrated, foregoing some potential in order to install sort of a new type of less destructive turbine. I would like, though, however, to provide or sketch out some context, which I think is important for the discussion of the appropriateness of hydropower dams and how they can be managed and installed in the Amazon. As we know, everything has meaning in a particular context, and it did strike me that Gabriel's presentation focused at the project level, but this is important to take into account, to set into the broader picture of in two dimensions, namely of national energy planning in Brazil, which is linked, I think, which needs to be linked nowadays to the vital topic of climate change. And the second point that I wanted to talk about as context is elaboration of some points that Gabriel made about the need for a more strategic, broader approach to Amazon development in the Amazon region. So my two main points here will be about of context will be on national energy planning in Brazil and the role of hydropower in that context linked to climate change. And then the second point, Amazon development approaches. So with regards to national energy planning in Brazil, a topic that I came to know a little bit in the early 1980s when I worked at USP with the Department of Energy and rather the Department of Economics and of Physics, when Brazil was facing a big crunch on oil imports and took some very important measures to try to stop importing oil. That was the period of development of the Pro-Álcool program. Many of these discussions have been going on in Brazil at a very high level, with great analytical power, with a lot of political force as well, ever since then. And so one of the things I'd like to say about that is that nowadays, as I think many of us recognize, that energy, in terms of national energy planning for Brazil, and for any country really, energy efficiency and energy conservation need to be at the top of every country's agenda. And this isn't just because of a global, it is also because of a global concern for climate change, but it's for the country's own good, for its energy independence and security, to rely less on imported sources of power. So if we look at the primacy of energy efficiency and conservation as a low-cost approach in many respects as well to satisfying functional needs, the growing energy demand in the Amazon region that Gabriel mentioned at one point of his presentation needs to be looked at in terms of does that estimate of growing demand for energy in the region, especially around Porto Velho, reflect as much investment in efficiency and energy conservation as is feasible right now? Is that the real number, taking into account the most broad and sort of conservation-minded approach to energy use, and keeping in mind that there is an imperative for growth and development there. People in that region undoubtedly have much lower per capita use of energy than we do, sitting here in this room and having traveled perhaps by cars to the meeting or by public transport. But the question remains, for Brazil's own sake and for that region's own sake, really, is that growing demand for energy that is cited as a justification for building additional dams, does it reflect the largest sort of conservation and efficiency possible? And are the dams needed for regional and local demand as well as national? In other words, as we all know, one of the realities of energy use in Brazil for many decades has been that the highest potential is in the Amazon, the greatest demand, the highest supply is in the Amazon, the greatest demand is in the southeast of the country. The transmission lines, the tariffs for the per kilowatt of hydropower may in fact be very low, but one question I would have for Gabriel is, how are those numbers calculated? What's the methodology? What's the price structure there? Do they include full externalities? Probably not. That would be quite rare, except for public numbers. Maybe it's so. I'd be very interested to know. Do the numbers for the hydropower tariff, for example, per kilowatt, price per kilowatt, include transmission lines down to the southeast? Those are high-tension transmission lines that are needed. That is very expensive, stringing it across that vast area. At a national level, what's really least expensive here in terms of a comprehensive approach that takes into account what we typically call the externalities that Odebrecht legitimately doesn't have to internalize in its accounts, nor does any other company, but the government should be taking it into account. And could some other source of energy be more appropriate from the Southeast? As I mentioned, the pro-alcohol program has been moving along since the 1980s. There is also a large potential, not just in Brazil, but in all of Latin America, for reuse and burning of bagasse. Could that supply more of the energy needed to the southeastern industry of Brazil in terms of its energy, of its industry needs, its transport needs? Brazil has that bagasse transformation technology quite well developed, as I understand. It's a leader in Latin America there. That's something they could export. Would that be worth doing at the national level of planning? A further effect, just to touch then also on the effects of climate change, which I think need to be taken into account at some level now in national energy planning. I wonder if Odebrecht is looking at the data on changing rainfall patterns in the Amazon and to what extent they feel that that would change their estimates of water flow, availability of quantity of water in the rivers where they are building dams, and the viability of those rivers in the medium and long term. Certainly, data on changing rainfall patterns in the Amazon alongside numbers on melting glaciers in the Andes suggest that water flows and quantity will be strongly affected in the Amazon River basins within a relatively short time. And given that the dams for other environmental concerns are being built as run-of-the-river dams, in other words, no big reservoir, run-of-the-river, doesn't that affect the hydropower potential? And what about other climate effects from the dams, such as methane emissions from some of the reservoirs? Those may be quite minimal in a run-of-the-river project, but they have health effects as well as climate change effects due to exposure of communities to methyl mercury. And on the other hand, as Gabriel mentioned, as much as 80 to 90% of Brazil's power is slated to come from hydro sources. Doesn't this make the country more vulnerable to climate change? And therefore, if they're not looking at alternative sources of energy, a little less energy secure. And again, I'd like to emphasize, this is context. This is not all the responsibility of Odebrecht, but it is important context for considering the role of hydropower dams in the country and in the Amazon. So then, just to go to my second point about the need to look at Amazon development patterns and alternatives, as was mentioned, for broader sustainability, the watersheds and the rivers in the Amazon need to be looked at in a comprehensive and strategic way. Placing a dam, or as this is the case of the Madeira, building multiple dams on one river obviously affects the water available for each of those dams. I'd like to understand a little bit better how Odebrecht, and really what I'd like to understand is how the Brazilian government is looking at this, the agencies in charge of energy and hydropower planning in the Amazon. In the case of dams on the Madeira, I understand that only a fraction, about 24,000 square kilometers out of 750 square kilometers of the entire river basin have in fact been assessed for possible impacts from the dams. There is a big part of the watershed in Bolivia, and there the effects on fisheries and sedimentation, the Madeira is a river that carries a big sedimentation load, have not apparently been analyzed adequately. Will the increased sedimentation cause flooding at the upper reaches of the river? I don't know if that's been looked at. The point I want to make is that, as Gabriel alluded, and I just want to reinforce this and strengthen this, really adequate and appropriate placement of dams should be done after there is a sense of how it will affect the whole watershed and where the future of that watershed is going, basically. And to be fair, Gabriel certainly did point to that in his final remarks. But I think that when you accept working at a particular project without taking that broader picture into account, you do run into some risks. There's also other indirect effects that have not necessarily been taken into account. The region of Porto Velho is a very rapidly growing one. If you provide it with more energy, obviously there's a demand for it, a very legitimate demand for human development. But if you put more energy down there, is that going to stimulate further in-migration to the region, further expansion, further forest cutting, use of other resources? And what does that do to the region as a whole? So overall, there is just a very strong need for strategic overall energy planning at the national level in Brazil, and a clearer plan which takes these factors, some of the factors I've mentioned, into account in terms of Amazon regional development planning. And certainly this is not at all entirely the responsibility of Odebrecht, but the company has a strong reputation for excellence in many regards, and they do participate in this process, which, sort of has a number of perhaps faults in it if one wants a really comprehensive strategic approach. And so I just wanted to lay this out as not being, again, Odebrecht's responsibility, but I'm curious to know how they do try to push the envelope towards a broader picture, and I just wanted to make these points to stimulate discussion.
Thank you, Christine. Before we open for comments and questions, and I will probably, if you allow me, I will go around first, and then you answer some of Christina's point. But I want just to recognize two people here. You are all very special to me and to the Wilson Center, but there are two people there sitting on the right that are advisors to the Brazil Institute and personal friends, Ambassador Luigi Einaudi and Professor Leslie Bethel. They are both members of the Advisory Council of the Brazil Institute, and Leslie has just rejoined us for 2 months as the senior scholar at the Brazil Institute, and actually on February the 11th he will be presenting a very interesting paper, a very provocative paper on Brazil and Latin America in a historical perspective. If you believe that Brazil is part of Latin America, you should come here at 10 o'clock, February the 11th. You may be surprised by his comments. Having said that, I would like to invite short, brief questions and comments, and then ask Gabriel to react. Who would like to go first? Yes, John.
Hi, I'm John Pielmeyer. I'm an independent consultant. I was recently in Lima and was given a very recent book by one of your former World Bank colleagues, whose name I don't remember, but I know he worked in Brazil for many years. He and his son had prepared a book that looks at the Andean Amazon and from the Peruvian perspective, mentions not only, I think, over 50 hydropower potential projects that are being discussed, 3 major road projects from Brazil to across Peru, 3 railroads and 1 hydrovia, most of which could be financed by BNDES, Brazilian Development Bank. And the question he raises is who's coordinating and prioritizing these programs from the Peruvian side, where he now lives, but also, coming back to Christine's point, how is this prioritized on a regional basis? And I'm wondering, from your experience at the bank and the World Wildlife Fund, what mechanisms you might suggest would be appropriate for looking beyond borders at these regional programs. Most of the hydro programs would be sending energy to Brazil rather than using it in Peru.
Yeah, well, okay, I think we have enough.
That's Marx Dorogiani's book, right? That he just, yeah. He was with the IDB, but I know him well.
Yes, sir. I think we have enough between Christine and John, so you could. I just would like.
Well, with Christine, I could have another couple hours of presentation, though. But I'll just try to. So, thanks, Christine. I'll try just to follow this sequence, and then we can explore a little bit more later. But in terms of how the tariffs are estimated and if they include full externality. I don't know of any tariff, anything in the world that includes full externalities, no, because externalities, no, there's an own part. But the tariffs are estimated with the total cost of investment and depreciation and known environmental and social externalities. So that's part of the tariff. We are responsible for everything that relates to the requirements of IBAMA, to the requirements of FUNAI, to the requirements of Historic Institute, and we have to pay for those requirements. So it's part of the tariff, those types of externalities. Now, for instance, there is no externality yet in Brazil, and I don't think there are in many countries, or in most countries, certainly not here, for terms for emissions, like climate. So those externalities don't exist yet, incorporated into tariffs in any sector, at least in Brazil or here in the U.S. A little bit in Germany, but that's the extent it goes. So those are not included. There is also a category of unforeseen things that might happen, which are part of the externalities, that are included in the tariff. Now, you had a very good question related to the transmission lines. Those costs are not included. And the basis for that thinking is that, first, transmission lines are auctioned separately or implemented separately by the government. In the same line that transmits, Brazil has an integrated grid from north to south, which is a major part of our reliability strategy to deal with offsets between droughts in one part of the country and not having droughts on the other. So that's part of the thinking and the strategy that has been quite successful. And the same transmission line that transports hydro energy, transport biomass energy, wind energy, or whatever, basically the producer pays a rent, if you will, that's the concept, to use somebody else's transmission lines. So that's how it works in Brazil. So those are not included in the cost. You talk about other sources of energy, and you specifically touch on biomass. I think that's been more and more on the Brazilian agenda. If you look at the projection for the next 30 years, actually the share of hydropower in Brazil is going to be smaller than it was before on the total grid. And part of that is a push towards diversifying the matrix so you have a little bit more flexibility and reliability. Now, that diversification does include, as I shown in the tariffs, incentives for things like biomass and wind energy. We own a bioenergy company, ETH, which is an ethanol company, one of the largest in Brazil, and we are one of the largest producers of biomass energy in Brazil. I definitely think that those alternatives need to be part of our matrix. They have to have a larger share of our matrix, but there are technical and scale limitations to sustain the growth of an economy of the size of Brazil with those types of energy sources. It's much easier on smaller economies, smaller countries to have larger shares. If you think about it, Germany still has 70% of its energy coming from coal. And they haven't been able, despite massive investments, to bring wind to the level that they hope to achieve. And I cite Germany not in the negative way. I think they are in the forefront of development of renewable energy. They have invested per capita more than anybody else, and still they are 70% dependent on coal. So it's very hard. So I think the strategy of the government of Brazil is to have a base basically sustained by hydropower, and the peak and the reserve sustained by other energy sources. Now, let me throw in my own personal criticisms to that. That has led to a very interesting situation in which it is easier today to license a thermal, coal, or oil-run power plant in Brazil than it is a hydropower. And I don't think that's right. It's a counter-cycle incentive in which if I want to burn oil or if I want to burn coal, I'm going to get a license or permit much, much easier than if I want to do hydropower. And I don't think that's a very wise outlook for the country. Personally, I believe that there are two sources of thermal energy for Brazil to consider: biomass and nuclear, third-generation nuclear. And that's my personal thing. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for Brazil to increase its share of energy from burning oil or burning coal. But that's my personal take on it. I think the government is looking at that. There are groups in Brazil that are looking at that, and I hope there will be advances. As a company, you ask, we are trying to influence the company, the strategy in that direction. We think, as a company, that if Brazil wants to increase its share of thermal power, it really needs to look at biomass and nuclear. Leave oil and coal behind. It's not our competitive advantage. Challenge of rainfall pattern in the Amazon. Yes, we're looking at those. We are participating in studies. I think this is something that's very much on our radar screen, and you need to monitor much closer into the future. Although we don't see any significant risks of impact in the projects that we have put in place right now due to the projected lifespans of these projects. Cascades of dams, I won't go into that because, just jump to that because it's a complicated one. On the impacts of the dam, I think that the share of the basin that has been looked at is way beyond what I would have done if I had the choice myself. I think we've looked at a very large share of the basin. I don't think the impacts of the dam go as far as we've looked. One thing that I'd like to demystify, dams do not produce sediment. Punto. Dams trap sediment. They do not produce. The increased production of sediment in the Madeira River coming from Bolivia is a consequence of deforestation and agriculture in Bolivia. It has nothing to do with any dams downstream. Punto. And that's like reality. You can't fight that. Production comes from deforestry, from poor agricultural practices. That's where the source comes. Dams trap sediment. Now, in this case, there will be no trapping. Because of the types of the dam and the turbines, the sediment is projected to go through the turbines. A regular dam would trap a lot of sediment in that case and would fill up very quickly. Now, this is something that's vital for this project. We have a sediment laboratory on site, and just to give you numbers, we're going to spend about $20 million monitoring sediments over the next 5 to 6 years. We've studied this as much as it can possibly be studied. We are pretty sure that it's going to go to the turbines. It's not going to affect our system, but we are monitoring it very, very close. Porto Velho, you're right. There needs to be a lot more thinking of what's going to happen with Porto Velho. I don't think I have time to go into everything that's taking place now, but there's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of work led by the federal government in terms of services in Porto Velho. It is going to grow. Now, it is part of the Brazilian development strategy, the growth of Porto Velho as a regional hub. I think in terms of conserving the forest, personally, I think that's very positive. Development in the state of Rondônia particularly has been very, very bad to the Amazon. It's the second highest deforestation rate. The economy is based on timber extraction, mining, and cattle. If it continues to be like that, I think the forest in Rondônia is going to go very, very quickly. Part of the government strategy is to do very much what happened in Manaus. You have an urban center in which you provide industries, you provide energy, other sources of labor, so people don't have to slash and burn. So I think it's part of the strategy. Personally, from my experience in the bank, I think it is the right strategy, and I think the dams will contribute to that. But it does involve a lot of other questions. On your question, John, on Mark's book, I've just started to read Mark's book. I think he raises some very, very legitimate points. And I alluded to those points when I said that we need to bring that discussion to a higher level within countries in terms of their integrated development strategies and across borders within the Amazon states. Now, that has been a challenge in the Amazon for many, many years. We created Ótica, hoping that Ótica would offer a forum for that type of discussion. Unfortunately, it has not offered the platform that I think the countries expected. It has a lot to do with politics. You know the politics of some of the Amazon states well these days. It's very hard to bring these different views together into a consistent plan for the Amazon basin. It is a huge challenge. It's a challenge that we need as countries to continue to try to tackle And I don't have good answers. It's something that we definitely have to do, and I agree with Mark, no, but it's one of those things that are much easier said than done.
Is there anything one can do just between Brazil and Peru?
Oh yeah, and I think the engagement of BNDES in Peru, the discussions that are taking place between the energy system in Brazil and in Peru could serve as a very effective forum for that. So I think in that case, there are strong mechanisms. The challenge is how we orient those mechanisms and those discussions in the right direction.
Yes, just one thing you mentioned, I think you're probably all familiar with what you mentioned about the Organization of the Amazon States, the treaty, which includes France, by the way.
Yeah.
There was a meeting recently. Sarkozy was the only one that really showed up. For reasons completely unrelated to the Amazon, might I say. Questions? Yes. Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
Alessandro Palmieri, World Bank. Thank you very much for organizing this and an excellent presentation, both of you. Gabriel, you know, for us working in development is a very difficult animal to deal with. You can start something, you can monitor, improve, but it's difficult to forecast what will happen. For sure, from what you described about the area, the situation is not going right if left untouched. I mean, illegal logging, misery, and so on. So the question is what to do. I mean, this is an opportunity to bring some electricity, some development in the area. The intentions are good. Maybe go right. He can go less than expected. He can go better than expected. But something has to be done. This is out of question, to my view. Now, you remember we worked together in the bank on this study on indirect economic impacts of dams, yes, the multipliers, and so on. Are you planning to do, is the government planning to do something like that to assess the impact, the direct, indirect impacts, stimulus to the local economy, and so is something on the programs of, I don't know, yourself or the government?
Yeah, the government is planning to do it, and I think they're already doing, but we're also doing that. Even before the project ever started, Alessandro, we started to collect information and data, and we have both consultants and researchers in place looking at things as diverse as average incomes, types of employments, health indicators. We have our own malaria group, full-time malaria group in the job site. We hired the best known malaria scientist in the Amazon, and she now works full-time for Odebrecht. So we are putting together a database and an evaluation system to look at those. But you are absolutely right. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to have answers. We want to have answers down the road about those indirect impacts, be them positive or negatives. The government is also doing their part of the work. We collaborate, but I think we need to do something more in-depth and more real-time, and I think that requires private quickness to do that. So we are developing the database. We're going to do some forums of discussions. We are working now on the development of a governance system for the project, in which we will invite, create a board composed of scientists, NGOs, different groups, to monitor not only the execution of the project, but also to work on evaluating the materials that are going to be produced in terms of the results of the work that we're doing on indirect impacts. Now, one brief thing that it's important, and I think it's something that I'm very hopeful that the new framework in Brazil is going to allow us to do better. With the new model in which you are responsible for the operation of the dam for the next 35 years, and you're a part owner, I think this represents a major change in perspective from companies that simply built dams before. No? Because what was the model before? The government would put a dam or a hydropower plant out for bid. You would win. They would give you the design. You would construct, be evaluated, deliver, get paid, and leave. Somebody else was responsible. For anything happened before, says, look, I have no liability here. I did exactly what I was hired to do. And that's it. Now, it's the government's problem, it's the operator problem, it's somebody else's problem. And that's the truth. Now it's different. The new framework requires this connection between implementation of the project, its operation. The owner of the project now, Santo Antonio Energia, they are liable for the life of the project for whatever we do in terms of the construction. We are part owners of that company. So it's a system that at least theoretically, because it hasn't been proved yet. I mean, there are some concessions that are already operating for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but not long enough, that I think it is prone to a much higher deal of accountability than the system that we have before. So definitely accountability is going to be much, much higher and for a longer period. Now, what's going to happen with that, we still have to see.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Gabriel, for inviting me to this presentation. I'm Abel Mejia, consultant. I have two questions, Gabriel. One is in relation to the other development on the Madeira. It's the Jirau. How is the status of that development? How that is coordinated with Santo Antonio? I think it's the two have been seen together for a long time. It's and how the two come together in the overall strategy of the government. The second is in relation to river navigation. That I know it's been a huge debate on that. Navigation has a tremendous regional development impacts, particularly for Bolivia, who is a landlocked state that's with a lot of land that in agriculture and soy production, and there is a lot of discussion in Brazil about that. And I haven't seen on the layout that there is any provision for navigation. So I'd like to know what's the policy, the decision of the government to not to take that on as it was initially presented.
Okay. The first one, Abel, you put me on a very tight jacket. But I'll just refer back to my last slide in which I highlight the role of government with enforcement, rule of the game, and provide incentives. Let me talk about ourselves, and I think you can infer my response regarding Jirau. Obviously, there is some coordination that takes place in terms of releases and fish passengers because it is a system, so the things need to be connected, and that coordination is led by the government. But I often find myself in a very tight jacket with explaining to my boss and to our board members why I'm spending so much money in certain things and others building dams very close to us are not, and they simply limit themselves to the legal requirements. It's very, very hard for me to explain sometimes. And I think when I talk about governments providing incentives and clear rules of the games, it would make my life and the life of those within our groups that want to do more much, much easier if there was a little bit of recognition for better performance or a little better enforcement for performance that we believe is under par. We just won a prize for sustainability in Santo Antonio last week. The people in Jirau were just voted in Davos the second worst company in performance in the world for Jirau. So it's very difficult for us. It creates a very difficult situation. I hope that with the examples that are taking place in Santo Antonio, I hope with the pressure that is being put in place by NGOs, not only upon us, but upon others that are and intend to develop hydropower in the Amazon, that I think the government of Brazil also has come to the realization that they need to raise the bar for everybody. So I hope that we'll be able to level the playing field a little bit more. But it's a tough question, of course, because I'm speaking about a competitor, and so. But I would say that I think Jirau is a very good project, but I haven't seen what they're doing. I wish, as a Brazilian, somebody that loves the Amazon, that they can do it as well as we are, or even better. I don't know if that's the case. I don't think it is. Navigation, look, the Madeira has been something on the Bolivian agenda for years. Many of you here might have heard of the Madeira Mamoré. There's a fantastic book, The Devil's Railroad, in which over, they say, 7,000 people from 69 different nationalities died trying to build this road. There's movies about it, this railroad. I think that navigation in Madeira makes a lot of sense, especially to Bolivia. Not so much upstream navigation, but downstream navigation from Bolivia into the Amazon ports, into the Atlantic. It would be important for the growth of that country to have that access. The Madeira is not navigable today, so it doesn't exist in navigation today. Navigation goes all the way to Porto Velho, and that's where Porto Velho in Rondônia, and that's where the sequence of cascades starts, so it's interrupted. So the dams provide that opportunity. There is provisions for locks in both dams. They are not bidded right now in the dams, but we're leaving the canals and the structure for the locks. And the idea of the government is that to bid those out together. That's what it makes sense. The problem is if we do locks only in Madeira and Jirau, you can only get to the Brazilian border. So it really depended also what's going to happen in Bolivia, how the Bolivian government decides to develop the upstream part of the basin, and then you could theoretically go upstream. But right now, if we put locks, there is the provisions. The idea of the government is to build the locks, maybe concession them out to a transportation company. We've looked at the project. We think it's viable, but it's really, no, it needs to be a sequence. Not if we do only Jirau and Santo Antônio, you can't go very far.
Well, thank you. On your first answer, I understood that there is a message, a built-in message to French ecologists to get busy and making some people in Paris pay attention. But questions, please. Or comment, yeah. Christine. Sorry.
I just wanted to make one comment and perhaps make a bold suggestion. Given sort of the reputation for excellence of Odebrecht and its sort of strategic vision, the question has been raised: what could the company do to push sort of a more strategic approach to river planning and to sound dams in the Amazon? And I think I tried to lay out some ideas about what direction that needs to go in before. But one suggestion, well, I actually have two suggestions, in terms of, or questions rather. Has Odebrecht ever refused to participate in a dam building project because the project itself could be done well, but the broader effects on the river basin are not going to be, the planning that's in place at a regional or national level for the river is not sound. And this may, in fact, as the exchange about Jirau and the relation between Jirau and Santo Antônio is pointing out to, may be the case still for the river Madeira. Your dam will be done with, sort of relative excellence in terms of current technologies and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, what does that add up to if the other, the maintenance and the management of the river as a whole is not done at a good level? And the other question I'd have is, does Odebrecht have a branch that invests in energy efficiency and conservation? That would be also, sort of a real leadership role. I don't know whether commercially that makes any sense. It has to be a hard-headed decision. That's how the company has stayed in business for a long time. But it is something that could be done and that could be considered, perhaps. And just a final comment on the sedimentation issues. I also did not imagine, you're absolutely right, that dams do not create sediment. They just trap it. But I think my point about sedimentation was that Santo Antônio, Jirau will possibly, particularly Jirau, will back up sedimentation on the river potentially, and that will be a problem. It's just my point about broader approach to river basin management. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just one comment on the sedimentation. Everything that we know now shows, including the work in Jirau, and we did a lot of the sediment work for Jirau before the auction, and I think they have followed suit with some real good people in that case. There are no indications whatsoever that will be any trapping of sediment in these systems. The water goes through the turbine. It's not the whole flow that goes through the turbine. Sediment moves primarily during the high flows. 99% of the sediment is going to go through. And there is no backwater effect in Bolivia. And that's a legal requirement. The license for Jirau is that continuously, every minute of every day, the historic water level at the border between Brazil and Bolivia needs to be maintained. So whatever they do with the operation, there will be no backwater going to the Bolivian territory. On your question, I don't know. I don't know if Odebrecht has refused to engage in the project on the basis of what you said. I know of a couple cases in which they have actually contributed and financed the modification of the plans so that the dams could be viable in our view. As a company, we have a set of policies and guidelines and principles that we follow, including things. We have our own resettlement policy. We have our own indigenous peoples policy, our own cultural heritage policy. So if we operate in markets where the legal system, for instance, does not have those guidelines into place, we would not engage in projects that do not allow us to observe minimally our guidelines, which in many cases are higher standard than the legal framework. So if it is a case in which a project would go against our company's principles, be it related to environment or ethics or labor, or say we are very strong, for instance, in workplace security. We have one of the best rates in the world. Workers' health. So if that goes against our limits, we would not engage in a project, and we have done that. I don't know if specifically about dams. We do implement projects on energy efficiency. We are not investing on those yet as an investor. As our energy branch grows more and more into an energy producing company as opposed to only an implementation engineering company, I believe that that's going to be the case. We're Odebrecht's energy group, I was telling Paulo, is on the verge of acquiring some existing assets in Brazil, acquiring other companies. And if that happens, I'm going to be part of the team that's going to be conduct the due diligence of those systems. And one of the things that it is in our plate for considering is retrofitting and efficiency gains. So when that happens, I could answer you, yes, we're going to be investing on that. To that moment yet, we have done it for other people, but not for ourselves.
Well, thank you, Leslie. Very quickly, because are there more questions? Yeah, Leslie.
Just very quickly, I'm aware that Belo Monte was not what you were supposed to be talking about today in your excellent presentation, but you did refer to it. And since it's all over the national and international press over the last 2 days, would you be prepared just to make some personal comments on what is going on with the Belo Monte project?
I can make some comments. I don't know if I'm going to make the comments that you would be hoping that I made. Look, one thing that concerned me through this process of Brazil looking at Belo Monte is that a lot of the discussion was centered on building the project or not building the project. And I strongly feel that that discussion should have been taken, or that decision should have been taken at a different level, not within the licensing procedure. As elected governments representing the majority of the society, the government is empowered by the Brazilian society to make those decisions. And if they've made those decisions in a transparent way, which I think they have, I think they also should have followed suit and said, look, this is not open for discussion anymore. Let's spend all these thousands of hours of meetings and discussions and the millions of dollars that were spent from groups pro and against Belo Monte to really focus on how can we improve the design of the reservoir, which systems can we put in place. And so in a way, I think a lot of energy has been wasted. on those discussions, and I hope that now that's evident and legally established that the project is going to be built by someone, that we can focus more on what are the drawbacks of the current design. Are there any drawbacks? What can we do better in terms of environment, in terms of integrating with the communities in the Xingu River and whatsoever. Obviously, it is a very challenging project, not only by its sheer size, it's a region that's even more complex than...
What is the projected output for...
The install capacity of Belo Monte is about 11,500 megawatts. That's the install capacity, not firm energy, which makes it the third largest hydropower plant in the world in terms of install capacity after Itaipu and Three Gorges in China. In terms of firm energy output, Itaipu is still the first. It produces more energy on an annual basis than Three Gorges. Three Gorges is the second. I think Belo Monte is probably going to be the fourth. So it's a very large project in an area that's highly sensitive. You know, there are indigenous communities that are legitimately concerned. It's a very poor area. It's a frontier development area too. Those of you who have ever gone to Hernani, I know, have been there to Altamira. It is a mess. It's a mess. So it's a very complex situation. I really think that whoever is to be engaged in that project really needs to do some of the things that we've done here and engage early on, try to understand the dynamics, cultural, economics, know how the society relates to the project locally and beyond, forge partnerships so they can develop a better project.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Gabriel very much for taking the time. Christine, thank you very much. For all of you present here today, I think this discussion was unimaginable in 1992 when I covered the Rio Earth Summit just 20 years ago. So this is, a little indication what the transformation going on in Brazil. I would like to ask you to join me in applauding our speakers. Thank you.